The dregs, then, she said. Her voice was level, a low thing that didn't carry far past the counter. Whatever's left. Mr. Gable polished a smudge from the glass display case with his thumb. He avoided her eyes. It was a kindness, she thought, or maybe it was shame. He was a good man running a business that wasn't doing much better than anyone else's. Abigail, I can't in good conscience sell them to you. They're late season. Probably not even fertile. The hens are tired. It's a waste of your coin. I'll take that waste. He finally looked at her. His face was a roadmap of prairie dust and worry. All of them? All of them. He sighed, a puff of air that smelled of sawdust and licorice. He gestured to the back room. His son emerged a moment later, carrying 2 wide, shallow crates. Nestled in straw were the eggs. They weren't the pristine, uniform ovals he sold to the more prosperous ranches. These were mottled, some too small, some oddly shaped. The forgotten ones. The afterthoughts. 320, Mr. Gable said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if announcing a final score in a game long lost. I'll give them to you for a penny apiece. And I feel like a thief even asking that. A few men loitering by the pot-bellied stove stopped their murmuring. Their silence was loud. She felt their eyes on her back as she counted out the coins from her worn leather purse. The copper clinked against the wood. It was a sound of finality. One of the men, a rancher named Patterson with a face like cured leather, let out a low chuckle. Gonna make the world's biggest omelet, Mrs. Weston. Abigail didn't turn. She slid the coins across the counter. Something like that. She and Thomas, the boy she'd kept on after John died, loaded the crates into the back of the wagon. Thomas was barely 17, all sharp angles and quiet loyalty. He handled the crates as if they held porcelain dolls, his brow furrowed in a deep, unquestioning concern that was more painful to her than Patterson's open mockery. He didn't ask. Not on the ride back, not as they carried the eggs into the barn. He just watched her, his gaze following her every move. The farm was quiet. It had been for a year. The silence was the heaviest thing John had left her. He had filled this land with his plans, his laughter, his endless, hopeful whistling. He saw life in every patch of dirt, potential in every splintered fence post. Now, the silence was a debt collector, knocking on the door every morning, sitting at the dinner table with her every night. John had believed in turkeys. Not chickens. Chickens are for scratching by, Abigail, he'd said, leaning on a fence post one evening, the setting sun turning the dust to gold. But a flock of good turkeys, that's a stake. That's security. They're smart birds. Hardy. People will always pay for a proper holiday bird. They'd saved for 2 years to buy their first breeding pair. A matched set of bronze turkeys, proud and iridescent. They'd gotten one good season out of them before the fever took the tom, and a coyote took the hen. And then, a different kind of fever had taken John. The farm was failing. The wheat had been thin, the corn stunted. The bank in town held the note, and Mr. Davies, the banker, was a man whose patience was measured in harvest yields. She had 1 season left. This one. And she had just spent her last bit of discretionary cash on 320 useless eggs. She stood in the center of the barn, the scent of old hay and dust thick in the air. The crate sat on the packed earth floor, looking small and foolish. Thomas's voice was gentle. What's the plan? She took a deep breath. She could still hear John's voice, a low murmur in her memory. The land doesn't waste a thing, Abigail. It's people who decide what has value. We're going to build a nursery, she said. The doubt in Thomas's eyes was a fleeting thing, quickly replaced by the determined set of his jaw. If she'd told him they were going to build a ladder to the moon, he would have fetched the hammer. For 2 days, they worked. They cleared a corner of the barn, sweeping it clean, patching the walls where the wind whispered through. Following a design John had sketched on the back of a feed bill one winter, they built long, low wooden boxes. They weren't incubators, not in the way the fancy poultry farms had them. They were hope chests. They lined the bottoms with sand, which they heated on the cast-iron stove in the main house, a constant, rotating supply. Abigail would scorch her hands on the heavy iron skillet, pour the hot sand into the boxes, and then Thomas would level it out with a trough. On top of the hot sand, they laid a thick blanket of wool, one of the good ones from her wedding chest. And on top of the wool, she placed the eggs. One by one. She handled each egg as if it were a jewel. She could feel the faint, desperate possibility of life inside. Or maybe she was just projecting her own. Thomas watched, his movements slow and careful, a silent partner in her folly. They need to be turned, she said, more to herself than to him. 4 times a day. 4 times, he repeated, nodding. And the sand has to stay warm. Always. Always. The first week was a blur of hauling hot sand, of turning eggs with gentle fingers, of watching. The men from the stove at Gable's store had apparently spread the story. Riders would slow as they passed the farm, their curiosity a palpable thing. She could feel their stares as she crossed the yard. The Widow Weston's folly, they were calling it in town. Patterson had made a joke about her trying to hatch fence posts next. She ignored it. She lived by the rhythm of the eggs. Up before dawn to heat the first load of sand. Turn the eggs. Mid-morning, new sand, turn the eggs. Afternoon, the same. And once more before she fell into an exhausted sleep, her hands raw and her back aching. On the 10th day, Dr. Finch stopped by. He was a traveling veterinarian, a man of science and quiet skepticism, with spectacles that seemed to perpetually slide down his nose. He made his rounds every few months. Heard a rumor, Abigail, he said, peering into one of the boxes. He nudged an egg with his finger. This is unorthodox. It's what I have, she said. He hummed a low, non-committal sound. The heat needs to be consistent. Any fluctuation, and the embryo dies. A drop of just a few degrees for an hour, he trailed off, letting the impossibility hang in the air. The sand holds the heat, she said. John figured it would. Dr. Finch looked at her over the top of his spectacles. John was a dreamer. A good man, but a dreamer. He checked the teeth on her old horse, pronounced him fit, and accepted a glass of water. As he prepared to leave, he paused. Don't set your heart on this, Abigail. Nature is a stern mistress. She just nodded. Setting her heart on it was the only thing she had left to do. 26 days later. Nothing. The sand was still warm. The eggs were still turned. But the silence in the barn had changed. It was no longer the quiet of anticipation. It was the heavy, flat silence of failure. Thomas didn't meet her eyes anymore. He just did the work, his shoulders slumped. Abigail felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The mockery hadn't hurt. The pity was what she couldn't bear. She had gambled on a dead man's dream, and she had lost. On the morning of the 28th day, she walked into the barn, steeling herself to clear out the boxes, to admit defeat. She lifted the wool blanket on the first box. And she heard it. A tiny, insistent peep. She froze. There, in the center of the box, was a small crack in one of the mottled shells. A hairline fracture. As she watched, the crack widened. A tiny, wet beak poked through. Thomas, she whispered. Her voice was choked. He came running. He skidded to a stop beside her, his eyes wide. They stood side by side, barely breathing, and watched the first poult fight its way into the world. It was a miserable-looking thing, damp and exhausted, but it was alive. It stumbled on its spindly legs and let out another, stronger peep. Then, from another corner of the box, another peep. And another. By noon, they had 6. By nightfall, they had 32. The barn, once so silent, was now filled with the sound of new life. Thomas looked at her, his face lit by the lantern, and he was grinning, a real, jaw-aching grin. John was right, he said, his voice full of awe. He usually was, she replied, a smile touching her own lips for what felt like the first time in a year. The next day, another 70 hatched. And the day after, 80 more. In the end, out of 320 useless eggs, 241 hatched. A success rate of over 75%. It was a miracle born of hot sand and stubbornness. Now the real work began. Keeping them alive. The poults were fragile. They needed constant warmth, clean water, and the right food. Abigail didn't have money for expensive starter feed. So she improvised. She boiled eggs, the few laid by their 2 remaining chickens, and mashed them with cornmeal. She spent hours foraging for tender greens and insects, just as a mother turkey would. Thomas built a low, wide pen, sectioning off a large part of the barn, and they kept the stove going day and night, fighting off the chill of the spring evenings. The word spread faster than fire on a dry prairie. Mr. Gable was the first to visit. He stood at the entrance to the barn, his hat in his hands, and stared at the sea of tiny, peeping birds. He murmured, shaking his head. He looked at Abigail, his expression one of pure astonishment. I sold you miracles for a penny apiece. You sold me a chance, she corrected him gently. I'm grateful for it. He left, looking dazed. The story he told at the store was different this time. The laughter stopped. It was replaced by a low hum of curiosity, of grudging respect. Patterson was heard to grumble that even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The poults grew. Their downy fluff was replaced by the first signs of feathers. Their peeps turned into chirps and trills. Abigail and Thomas were relentless. They cleaned the pen daily. They expanded it. They learned the individual personalities of the birds. There was one bold Tom who always ate first, a shy hen who hid behind the water trough. They were no longer just a flock, they were a community she was nurturing. By late summer, they were no longer fragile chicks. They were adolescents, gawky and full of energy. She opened the barn doors and let them out into a newly fenced pasture. They surged out into the sunlight, a wave of mottled brown and black, and immediately began to forage. They were healthy. Their eyes were bright, their feathers glossy. Dr. Finch returned on his autumn circuit. He'd clearly heard the stories, but his face was set in its usual professional skepticism. He walked into the pasture, and for the first time, Abigail saw him truly taken aback. He stopped, pushing his spectacles up his nose, and just watched the flock. They moved like a single organism, a slow-moving river of birds, picking at the ground, their heads bobbing. Remarkable, he said. He spent an hour in the pasture. He had Thomas catch 3 different birds, chosen at random. He examined their plumage, checked their weight, looked for any sign of sickness or malnourishment. He pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. What are you feeding them? She told him. The mashed eggs and cornmeal, the foraged greens, the soured milk, the insects. He wrote it all down. And your hatching method? She described the sand, the wool blankets, the 4 turns a day. More notes. He finally closed the notebook and looked at her, his scientific reserve melting away into something that looked like profound respect. Abigail, he said, his voice serious. The survival rate for commercially hatched poults, even at the best farms, is around 50 to 60% from hatch to maturity. You hatched these from discard eggs, in a barn, using hot sand. I know. Your survival rate, he said, tapping his notebook, is over 90%. I've never seen anything like it. The birds are heavier than they should be for their age. Their feathering is perfect. You haven't just kept them alive. You've created an ideal environment for them to thrive. He shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. John always did say you paid more attention than anyone he knew. That night, a feeling settled over Abigail that she hadn't felt since before John's passing. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the feeling of solid ground beneath her feet. As autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek yellow and gold, the turkeys reached their full size. The toms were magnificent, their chests broad, their tail feathers fanning out in displays of iridescent pride. Their gobbles echoed across the valley in the crisp morning air. Mr. Henderson, who owned the mercantile in town, was the next visitor. He was a practical man whose entire business model depended on the success or failure of the surrounding farms. He'd had a hard year. The drought had hit the cattle ranches, and his orders for beef were down. Thanksgiving was his chance to make up the difference. "Mrs. Weston," he said, getting straight to the point. "I need 50 birds." "Good, heavy ones," he paused. "I hear yours are the best in the county." The phrasing was a quiet revolution. "Not the only ones or the ones that survived are the best." "I can provide them," she said. "I'll pay a premium," he offered. 20% over the usual rate. "For quality." They shook on it. As he was leaving, he turned back. "Patterson came into the store yesterday. Said he was looking for a good bird. I sent him to you." The irony was not lost on her. The week before Thanksgiving was a whirlwind. First came Mr. Henderson's order. Then came the others. Homesteaders whose own small flocks had failed. Ranchers looking for a centerpiece for their family tables. And then, as promised, Patterson. He rode up, dismounted, and stood by the fence, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. He looked uncomfortable and out of place. He began, not meeting her eye. "Here you've got turkeys for sale." "I do," she said, her tone even. There was no triumph in it. "Just fact." "I'll take your biggest tom," he said. "Whatever the price." Thomas caught the bird, a magnificent 25-pound creature. As Abigail took Patterson's money, he finally looked at her. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out in a gruff rush. "What you did here, it's something." He cleared his throat. "I owe them birds an apology." She gave him a small, forgiving nod. "They're just turkeys, Mr. Patterson. They don't hold a grudge." When the last bird had been sold, Abigail sat at her kitchen table with Thomas and counted the money. It was a staggering amount. More than they had made from wheat and corn in the last 3 years combined. She separated out a thick stack of bills. "This is for Mr. Davies at the bank," she said. It was enough to pay off the most pressing part of the loan and secure the farm for another year. Maybe 2. The rest went into a tin box. For feed. For supplies. For the future. Thomas looked at the remaining money, then at her. "You did it. You saved the farm." "We saved the farm, Thomas," she corrected him. "We did." The story didn't end there. It rippled. The following spring, Dr. Finch published an article in the Plains Agricultural Journal. He didn't have a name for her methods, so he gave it one. He called it the Western method of incubation and rearing. He described the hot sand, the wool blankets, the simple, protein-rich diet. He included his data on the hatch rate, the survival rate, and the final weight of the birds. He called it a breakthrough for the small-scale farmer, a way to turn waste into profit using resources already at hand. The article was read. Letters began to arrive at the small post office for her. A farmer from Nebraska asking about the exact temperature of the sand. A woman from Kansas wanting to know how she foraged for the right greens. A cooperative in Colorado asking for details on the pen construction. She answered every one. Her replies were simple, direct, and practical. She shared what she knew without fanfare. Mr. Gable approached her before the new season began. "Abigail," he said, his tone full of deference. "I won't be discarding any eggs this year. But I'd like to offer you the first pick of every clutch. No charge." "A partnership?" She agreed. But she suggested something more. She told him to offer the same deal to other families in the area, the ones who were struggling just as she had been. Teach them the Western method. Give them a chance. Let everyone have a stake. A new economy began to bud. That year, 5 other families started small turkey flocks using her techniques and Gable's late-season eggs. The next year, it was 15. The area, once known for its stringy cattle and failed corn, was becoming known for its turkeys. The Thanksgiving market, once a gamble, was now a reliable source of income for dozens of families. They formed a loose cooperative, sharing knowledge and resources, with Abigail as their quiet, unassuming center. They didn't have formal meetings. The meetings happened over fence posts, at the mercantile, or in her barn, where she would patiently explain the right consistency for the cornmeal mash or show a newcomer how to spot a weak poult. One afternoon, 2 years after she'd bought the eggs, a man in a fine suit came out from the territorial capital. He represented the Agricultural Board. He had read Dr. Finch's article and the follow-up reports. He had heard about the Western Cooperative. He walked through her flock, which was now larger and even healthier than the first, and he asked the same questions Dr. Finch had, but with an eye for policy, not just science. "You've changed the entire economic outlook for this valley, Mrs. Weston," he said, looking around not just at the turkeys, but at the new paint on her barn, the sturdy new fence, the look of quiet prosperity that had settled over the land. "The turkeys did that," she said simply. "I just gave them a warm place to start." He smiled. "The board would like to officially endorse your method. We want to print pamphlets, distribute them to homesteaders across the territory. We believe this could be a model for sustainable small farm agriculture." She thought about that. Pamphlets with her name on them. It seemed like a strange fate for a woman who had just been trying to keep a roof over her head. "It was my husband's idea," she said. "The important parts of it, anyway. He's the one who deserved the credit." "Then we'll name it the Western Method," the man said. "To honor you both." That evening, long after the man from the capital had gone, Abigail stood with Thomas on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was filled with the contented, rumbling purrs of the turkeys settling down for the night. It was a sound of peace, of security. The farm was no longer silent. It was alive, humming with a gentle, persistent energy. Her energy. "He would be proud," Thomas said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "John. He'd be so proud of all this." Abigail looked out at the fields her husband had loved, at the flock that had saved them. She could almost feel him there beside her, his solid presence a comfort against the cooling air. She remembered his hands, calloused and gentle, the way he could look at a barren patch of ground and see a harvest. She remembered his unwavering faith in the things others overlooked. "The land doesn't waste a thing, Abigail," his voice echoed in her memory, clear as a bell. "It's people who decide what has value." She had been one of those people, adrift and drowning in what the world had told her was worthless, a failing farm, a dead man's dreams, a crate of leftover eggs. But she had learned. She had looked past the judgment of others and found the spark of life that was waiting there all along. She hadn't created it. She had just shielded it from the cold, given it a chance to grow. A quiet triumph settled in her heart, warm and steady as the sand she had once used to hatch a future. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was understated, resilient, and utterly her own. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but sure, carrying on the evening breeze. "I think he would."